Hello everybody and welcome back to Rev Left Radio. On today's episode we have back on a multi-time guest, Alexander Avina, the professor of history from ASU. He's on to talk about his recent spat of articles, a part 1 and part 2, in Foreign Exchange's Substack, called The American Maginot Line. And it's really an investigation and an analysis of the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, the role that the border and the borderlands around it have played in American history, and how the maintenance and policing of that border was part and parcel with broader processes of settler colonialism and U.S. imperialism. So this is a really fascinating, interesting, and genuinely unique dive into this topic, and I'm really happy to be able to share this conversation with you today. So without further ado, here is my wonderful conversation with Professor Alexander Avina on his article, The American Maginot Line and U.S.-Mexico Borderlands. Enjoy.
My name is Alex Avina. I'm a history professor at Arizona State University, and thank you for having me back on, Brett. This is, I don't know, 4th or 5th episode?
I can't even keep track anymore.
Yeah, but it's great. So I love coming back and conversing with you.
Absolutely. It's an honor to have you back on, and this topic is a very interesting one. I'm glad we're going to be able to dive into it. You wrote a series of articles titled The American Maginot Line, Part 1 and Part 2, through which you kind of discuss and analyze and critique the history of the borderland between the U.S. and Mexico, and how that border was really, in so many ways, the training grounds for the broader imperialist and colonialist endeavors that the U.S. would fall into as they became an empire. And so I found these articles very interesting. They analyzed aspects of the border that I had not really come across, and so I'm excited to get into it. I think the first question to kind of talk about, and it might seem obvious, but I think it is interesting, is what exactly is a borderland? What makes something a borderland other than just the border is in that area? And then how did the Mexico-U.S. border as it exists today, come to be established?
Yeah, so I think that it's not that simplistic of a question, Brent. I think a lot of academics, we tend to kind of bypass the most simple questions because in many ways they're the most difficult. But I would say that a borderlands region, it depends on your positionality from which you're trying to define that concept, right? So if you are a person who's living in Nogales on the Mexican side of the U.S.-Mexico border, right? The border, your definition of the borderline is going to be different than an American living on the American version of Nogales on the U.S. side of the border. But roughly speaking, the borderlands is a broader region that extends beyond a demarcated international boundary or border between different nation states. But some of the most interesting stuff that I've read about borderlands will focus on communities that have managed to create shared cultural, political, and economic ties across and despite ways of separation that nation states have managed to create. And in particular, in regards to the U.S.-Mexico border, that region has been a borderlands region for a long time, in which communities on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico borders have managed to create meaningful transnational communities because people, travel across borders to work, to shop, to visit families, to get accessible forms of healthcare, as many Americans do, crossing over to the Mexican side of the border today. Right, so there's to think about borderlands, to think about this area from a communal or an individual, humanistic perspective, whereas the border is something that is an artificial construct created by different nation states to separate one nation state from another. The idea of a border for me, and this year I'm really influenced by, I think the very first theorist that I was influenced by as the son of undocumented Mexican migrants was this norteño band called Los Tigres del Norte, which is, these guys were kind of like the balladeers of the Mexican migrant experience in the U.S. And I remember growing up and listening to their songs. And they use that one line that's become kind of like a staple of migrant rights, which is we didn't cross the border crossed us. And growing up in a household of led by parents who lived without papers and undocumented status in the U.S. for decades, like that kind of shaped my idea of what the border was. And in that sense, the border, by its very existence, represents or signifies both the violence that it took to create it, right? Imperial colonial violence in this instance that I'll get into in a sec, but also the violence that it requires to maintain the border. And this is really what my two articles for the Foreign Exchanges Substack tried to address, both like these foundational moments in which the U.S.-Mexico border was created through imperial violence, through colonialism, through particularly settler colonialism, but then the constant types of violence that it was required to maintain it, right? Especially against an array of perceived outsiders that American elites viewed as somehow threatening to the national sovereignty and to the racial body politic of the United States. So the idea, and then I guess another way to answer this question is to kind of just think about my own personal political and intellectual development engaging with this idea, right? So growing up in this household with my undocumented parents, listening to these Los Tigres del Norte songs, whose constant message was about transcending borders and this idea that, what used to be large swaths of the United States used to belong to Mexico, and this idea of we didn't cross the border strikes us. Like that was a very like a binary nationalistic conception of what the border and the borderlands are and represented historically. And then it was really maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago when I started to dive in some of the literature on settler colonialism and American Indian studies and histories, where I started to really question that, right? And to think about or interrogate, what does it mean when someone says we didn't cross the border crossed us? I mean, there was folks who were living there before borders were created and borders were transcended and crossed, right? So, thinking about how settler colonialism on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border have created, despite national differences, despite differences between the United States and Mexico historically today, they still share this mutual shared interest that historically goes back to particular forms of settler colonialism that were in practice in the late 19th century, in which Native American groups and polities were displaced from land that was originally theirs. So I think that's an interesting question to think about. And it's just shaped my entire view of what U.S. empire is and how it came to be and how we can define it to begin with. And I think that really went into writing these two articles. And it was also within the broader context of like it was a 20th year commemoration of 9/11, and also this idea of what a forever war is and was and continues to be also went into shape, my thinking on this. The short little, I'll try to make the short little history of how the U.S.-Mexico border came to be. There's various points where we can start, but the easiest one is to talk about the what is now, usually taught in the U.S. as the Mexican-American War or the U.S.-Mexico War that broke out in the mid-19th century. There's long historical antecedents to this war that broke out. A lot of it has to do with Texas. It's always Texas's fault. But the separation of Texas from Mexico in the 1830s and the inability of Mexico to bring it back into its nation state, and we get this 9-year period in Texas where it's the Lone Star Republic until it's annexed into the U.S. in 1845 against the explicit warnings of the Mexican government, saying that if the U.S. had ever annexed it, it would be tantamount to a declaration of war on Mexico. And the war breaks out in 1846, precisely over the question of where the internationally recognized boundary of the U.S. and Mexico was. The U.S. claimed that the border was marked between Texas and Mexico was marked by the Nueces River, which is a bit north of what is now the internationally recognized border, which is the Rio Grande or the Rio Bravo. And the U.S. troops who were sent to the border, not recognizing Mexican claims to what the border was, crossed it, set up a series of forts, and Mexican soldiers attacked them. And that was enough of a pretext for the U.S. to declare war under President James Polk. And we get the Mexican-American War, in which the U.S. will invade Mexico on two fronts from 1846 until 1847. You have a group that crosses from what is now southwestern United States into northern Mexico. And then eventually, due to the difficulties that U.S. military expedition faced for a variety of reasons, Polk sends another expedition that will take off from New Orleans, land in Veracruz on the Gulf Coast, eastern Gulf Coast of Mexico. And this force will more or less follow the route that Hernán Cortés followed, hundreds of years before when him and eventually hundreds of thousands of indigenous allies would overthrow the mighty Mexica or Aztec Empire. And then by September of 1847, after a series of famous battles in Mexico City, the U.S. raises the American flag over in the Zócalo, in the main city plaza of Mexico City. And that moment becomes really important for a variety of reasons. A bunch of U.S. Civil War officers who will later become famous participated in this operation. If you know the U.S. Marine Corps song, it includes the line "the halls of Montezuma" because it's a reference to this military operation. When the Americans finally take over Mexico City, they couldn't really find any Mexican government officials to negotiate with. And it took them a couple of months to finally find some that would negotiate to an end, because the longer the Americans stayed, the more popular resistance that they were generating in Mexico City. There was increased street violence. And eventually this leads to, in February of 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which more or less establishes the border that we know today, this almost 2,000-mile long border between Mexico and the United States. There was a change in 1853, with the Gadsden Purchase, with southern Arizona, south of the Gila River, or close to where I am today, will be taken from Mexico, will cede to the United States for an amount of money. One more thing I'll mention, and this is something that goes back to my earlier point about indigenous histories and settler colonialism and how my perspective has changed. It's a great historian at Berkeley by the name of Brian DeLay, who has this great book called War of a Thousand Deserts. And he really made a huge impact into kind of forcing historians to rethink the Mexican-American War from an indigenous perspective. And he makes his argument that what really, the indigenous polities who lived in the borderlands, so the Kiowas, the Comanches, the different Apache groups, they actually played a decisive role in a variety of ways, weakening northern Mexico. Beginning in the 1830s with a series of devastating, yearly raids that they would launch deep into central Mexico. And essentially, in the words of an American who crossed through northern Mexico during the war, they were crossing through lands that were, it looked like 1,000 deserts. They were completely depopulated. So DeLay makes this really fascinating argument that it was indigenous polities who fundamentally shaped both the outbreak of war and also the resolution of the war between Mexico and the United States. And that's really fascinating to think about, right? Because in 1848 and then after 1853 with the Gadsden Purchase, even though you have the setting of an internationally recognized border on maps, that didn't translate into actual political and geographic control on the ground. The border that we think of today will remain in the hands of different powerful indigenous polities throughout the 19th century. So one of the articles I mentioned this, when both the U.S. and Mexican government sent out these mapping and survey expeditions in the 1850s to kind of precise where the border is going to go. In some instances, that these groups had to ask local indigenous polities for permission and for safe haven in order to be able to do their work. So if we're, and in parts of Arizona and New Mexico, the border will be effectively controlled by different Apache groups well into the 1880s, right? So again, this idea that, and this will have an impact onto how the U.S. government in particular would think about the border to this day, the idea of what constitutes a secure border, what constitutes an insecure border, and then how does that shape questions about national sovereignty, particularly during moments of imperial anxiety or in moments where U.S. elites feel a bit insecure about the robustness of national borders.
Yeah, and we'll definitely get into that part about the imperial anxiety and whatnot. And the point that you're making about the Apaches and indigenous communities along in this borderland all the way up, 53 after the Gadsden Purchase. Technically, this is now U.S. dominated territory, but in practice, de facto, it's still politically dominated by these indigenous groups. I think that's, fascinating and something we don't really think about. And then how those indigenous groups like the Apaches and the Comanches went on to shape the culture and the border and all of those things in that area, even, lasting until today, legacy-wise. And we'll get into that in a second. I just wanted to touch on an aspect of Borderlands that I find interesting and that you're touching on there, which is even as the technical border shifts, in the wake of conflict and wars, the interesting aspect of a borderland is that the linguistic and cultural overlap remains. The people remain. So the border can shift all at once on paper, but the communities that are established in these areas continue to go on and influence the cultures. And so we have in the southern U.S., especially in the Southwest, very heavy representation of Mexicans in particular, Central Americans broadly. And that goes on to radically shape, even down to like the aesthetics of New Mexico, shaped by Mexican culture. And on this other side of the border in northern Mexico, it is in many ways much more Americanified, right, than southern Mexico. And so
Yes.
you have this two-way,
yes.
this two-way bleeding over into one another. And on the ground, it's almost impossible to really see with your own eyes where, this cultural mixing starts and ends. All you really have is this technical border. I also wanted to mention that we also, borderlands exist around the world, obviously, and there's hundreds of them, some very fraught, some more or less very mild and tame. But the Russia-Ukraine borderland is very much in the news right now because the Donbass is this borderland area where technically it's inside the borders of Ukraine, but culturally, linguistically, ethnically, they're very much aligned with and come out of Russia. And so you see that how that complication can lead to, all of the tumult and conflict going on over in Eastern Europe right now. So those are just some things I wanted to say about the borderland.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. And I probably should have mentioned a couple of obvious things that resulted from this short history that I just mentioned that I think you touched upon, Brett, is that, as a result of 1848, Mexico loses, between a third and a half of its national territory. So much of what is now the U.S. West and U.S. Southwest used to belong to Mexico because they used to be colonial possessions of Spain, and will shift over to the United States. And I think one of the interesting things to think about within just like the long array of U.S. history is that the U.S. history is like the part of it is the acquisition. It's the settler colonial history, the acquisition of lands, right, on paper, on maps, whether it's the Louisiana Purchase or all these lands that were acquired as a consequence of the Mexican-American War, or the War of Northern Aggression, as they call it in Mexico. But then how to actually implement like power and sovereignty on the ground is something different, right? And it requires massive amounts of violence and bloodshed. And the people who will suffer that, particularly in the 19th century, beginning in the late 18th century, early 19th century, are the people who lived there originally, right? Indigenous polities, indigenous communities. So I think maps are one thing. Maps are, you kind of display kind of like the aspirational hopes of a nation state, but then translating those aspirations into like physical reality requires a massive amounts of settler colonialism and violence. And I think that's something really important to keep in mind. One other thing I'll mention really quickly about the 1848 Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the Gadsden Purchase is that one of the articles that was included in the treaty in 1848 held the U.S. responsible for cross-border indigenous raids. So if Apaches and Comanches and Kiowas and other groups continued to do cross-border raids, the U.S. was responsible for stopping those raids, and if any Mexican citizens were taken hostage or suffered any sort of economic damages, the U.S. government was responsible for that. So obviously, like Americans who knew the terrain, when they saw that article, they knew that, especially military officials, they knew that was going to be an impossibility. So one of the interesting things about the Gadsden Purchase that will occur in 1853, just a couple years later, is that the U.S. put in an article. They got rid of the previous article that held the U.S. responsible for stopping cross-border indigenous raids and the kidnapping of Mexican citizens, because it took them 5 short years to realize that was an impossibility, and it was going to remain an impossibility for much of the 19th century. Different Apache groups, particularly those led by like the famous Geronimo, he hated Mexicans almost more than he hated Americans, right? So they weren't going to stop their cross-border raids, and they weren't going to let a map and a treaty signed between the U.S. and Mexico preventing them from doing what they had been doing since the early 1830s.
Yeah, incredibly interesting. And just one more thing to add to this before we move on to the next question, which just kind of came to my mind as we're talking about borderlands and the culture and the history of those lands changing hands over and over again. And the recent tragedy a few years ago of the El Paso shooting by the white supremacist, the motivation there was like, there's too many Mexicans in Texas. Like, there's too many Mexicans coming into America. It's like, they were here so much like fucking longer than you know, the lack of knowledge of this history plus the settler colonial white supremacist mentality results in this fucking tragedy where people who have been there much longer than probably even the European immigrants that gave birth to this mass shooter are victimized, targeted, attacked because they are seen as encroaching on land that isn't theirs. I mean, it would be laughable if it wasn't so fucking tragic, you know?
Yeah, I mean, and you see this like in where I grew up in Central California. They had they still around, right? These Franciscan missions that were established in the late 1700s. It was kind of like a last ditch effort by the Spanish Empire to kind of populate what is now California. The Spanish and the Mexican governments always had a problem populating these lands that later with settlers that later became the West and the Southwest United States. And one of the things that happened after throughout the late 19th century, after the Mexican-American War and into the early 20th century, is that some of these mission towns, like the one I grew up in San Luis Obispo, they would organize these fiesta days where it was these weird like celebrations of like a Spanish past and Spanish heritage while completely subsuming Mexicanness or Mexican markers of cultural identity. And a lot of that has to do with race, right? Like tagging Spanishness and the Spanish colonial past as somehow white. And Mexican, and we can get into this as well, becomes racialized in very particular ways throughout the long scope of U.S. history, particularly since the resolution of the Mexican-American War, right? So, you know, it's this weird dynamic of completely erasing like the California's like Mexican past and the actual Mexicans who were living in California when I was there witnessing these festivals in the 80s and 90s by hearkening to this bygone, like highly racialized past. And that's the kind of mentality that in a way is not too disconnected from the fantasies that drove this shooter to like drive 7 hours from where he was living to El Paso, because he identified El Paso as a quote unquote Mexican space where he decided to wage his white genocidal his violence, right? So this has a long history to it, and a lot of it has to do with the consequences of 1848 and the consequences of establishing this rigid border that is not just a physical infrastructure, right? But in many ways, it's a racial border, it's a political border, it's a cultural border as well.
Exactly, and the recent quote unquote crisis with the Haitian refugees and their treatment is another stark example of how that racialized world order is very much at play, even when Mexicans themselves are more or less absent from the border conflict in that one instance.
Yeah, man. Like anytime you hear crisis at the border, like your bullshit meter should like go off.
Exactly.
And there is no crisis at the border. The border itself is the crisis. Like the border, this idea and this infrastructure that has killed thousands of people since the 1990s when they started to build massive walls along this long stretch of this border. That's the crisis. Not, you know, poor people displaced by capitalism and U.S. empire abroad trying to escape and find a better life here.
Now, with that,
sorry, I had to go on that rant.
No, that's important,
yeah, anyway.
and it generated another question, which is the construction of border walls starting in the 90s seems to coincide, you know, pretty well with the establishment of NAFTA, which among other things allowed for capital to have no borders in effect, but for labor needed stronger borders, right? So if you're going to go over as an owner of capital to Mexico to exploit their cheap labor, you're going to need to militarize that border to keep that pool of labor, the cheaper pool of labor, and that's going to require a hard break at that border for the interest ultimately of capital, at least in that instance.
No, there's no doubt. And if you read the papers and the especially the U.S. negotiators of NAFTA and some of the policymakers involved in it, they damn well knew that this free trade agreement was going to devastate large segments of the smallholder campesino agriculture economy in Mexico. And what do people do when they're devastated economically? They're going to move. And they're going to move to Mexican cities, or they're going to try to move into the United States. So they knew that. So it's no accident that we get NAFTA on the one hand, right, unfettered movement for capital across national borders, and at the same time we're getting the building of walls. In many instances, I mentioned in the article, some of these walls were built out of helicopter landing pads that were used in Vietnam, right? So there's so many like imperial connections that are condensed in the actual space that is now the U.S.-Mexico border.
Yeah, and that leads perfectly to this next question, which is, in your article, The American Maginot Line, you argue, quote, the U.S.-Mexico border now and historically is a primary site of U.S. imperial formation, where settler colonialism and imperialist aggression converged as mutually constituting projects. Now, you've definitely alluded to some of those arguments in the answer you've already given, but I was hoping that you can kind of lay out that basic argument. We're going to get into the details of it, but the umbrella bird's eye view of that basic argument before we go deeper.
Yeah, so that argument has to do with, and again, a lot of it has to do with my own personal evolving thinking on this issue. But so thinking about the U.S.-Mexico border, both as the result of U.S. imperial expansion, right? It's the first instance in which the U.S. invades a sovereign Latin American nation and ends up taking like large swaths of its land, right? That's like the more traditional story. And if you're a Latin Americanist historian, that becomes like the gateway to, dozens of U.S. military interventions into Latin America for the rest of the 19th and early 20th century. But what I was really also interested in is how the process of actually, again, going back to the map, actually making or translating U.S. sovereign control over this physical territory into an actual physical material reality. And one of the ways that I got at this history was to think about where I live today, Arizona, and what it took to make Arizona what it is today. And what it took was the longest war in U.S. military history, right? Or a series of wars, which are the so-called Apache Wars. So depending on how do you periodize it, from the late 1850s to early 1860s, up until the final capture of Geronimo, 1885, 1886, around that time, the U.S. military and different U.S. military units are going into Arizona and trying to establish control over this physical territory through the creation of almost 50 different military outposts and bases, the stationing of cavalry units to chase down and to capture or kill these rebel Apache groups who are refusing to submit themselves to U.S. political authority. And thinking about then how that becomes that, so this war and eventual defeat of Geronimo, in combination with the earlier violence that it took to create this, take half of Mexico's national territory and create this national border, how that becomes kind of like a springboard. Both imperial violence and settler colonial violence becomes a springboard for the U.S. becoming a transcontinental empire, beginning with the 1898 Spanish-American War, in which the U.S. goes to war with Spain and acquires its colonies in Puerto Rico, in Guam, and the Philippines, and a semi-colony in Cuba. And so the idea is then in this border space, the history of the U.S., particularly U.S. military and settler experience in this space and what is now Arizona, how that then, and the people who were involved, these individuals, how that influenced and shaped them, this group of military officers that historian Catherine Bjork refers to as prairie imperialists, will then go on to lead U.S. military imperial adventures abroad in the Caribbean and in Asia in the late 19th and early 20th century. So that's like one part of the argument. The other part is to think of it more domestically, and here I've been really influenced by, I have this brilliant colleague here at ASU, Julian Lim, who's a historian of U.S. immigration and U.S. empire, and she has a paper where she talks about how much of U.S. immigration law and the creation of a U.S. immigration regime really doesn't start to emerge until the 1890s. And in many ways, it's spurred by these new American acquisitions of Caribbean and Asian colonies. But she also makes another really interesting argument in which she connects both the nativist, anti-Asian, particularly anti-Chinese immigration laws that start to be passed in the 1880s, restricting Chinese people from actually entering the United States, with legislation at that same moment in the 1880s that essentially plundered and took away the territorial sovereignty of Native American polities throughout the United States. So on the one hand, you have like this U.S. empire expanding south into the Caribbean and west into Asia and the Pacific world, but then they're also matching that by creating an immigration regime that is fundamentally based on the exclusion of Chinese laborers, but that is also based on legislation and federal law that treated Native Americans as internal foreigners or stateless foreigners that could then be legally deprived of political, economic, and essentially cultural sovereignty at the same time. So again, it's another way for me to kind of think through both, more traditional concepts of like U.S. empire and how it's fundamentally connected to these legacies and these practices of settler colonialism abroad. And I think that's like the broader argument that I'm trying to make, is that when we try to understand U.S. empire, not thinking about it necessarily as blowback, or not necessarily thinking about it, oh, we went abroad, the U.S. government went abroad, and then empire comes home, but more in like the Aimé Césaire way of thinking about it in terms of a colonial boomerang, right? Like the boomerang was launched from the borderlands, from the U.S.-Mexico border. That boomerang then went through the Caribbean, went through the Pacific world and Asia, but then will come back home to the border in this generative like circulation of technology, of knowledge, of individuals who helped create what we now think about the U.S. as and think about as U.S. empire.
Yeah, that colonial, boomerang image and concept is very interesting, very helpful. On Red Menace, we did a whole episode on discourses on colonialism by Césaire. If folks are interested in his work on this topic in general, because it's very, very enlightening.
Yeah, I love that book.
Totally, it's crucial.
Oh man, the first time I read that book, I wanted to get up and like start making Molotov cocktails. I don't know, like that book like blew my mind. Like the first time I read it, I was just it's so, everyone read it. It's so short, and I promise once you like dive into it, you can't put it down because it's a quick read, and it's just, for me at least, it was so powerful and compelling. I was like, all right, what do we do now?
For sure.
But anyway, so that's my plug for discourse on colonialism.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's he's also a poet, wasn't he? So there's this poetic linguistic structure and language that is eminently readable and just engaging in every way. But basically. Yeah, so this argument is very interesting. It's a new way of looking at the formation of, or how the establishment and maintenance of the border was the part of this broader process of settler colonialism and then eventually imperialism. And a lot of this revolves around, or at least one of the things that you really highlight is, I think I'm saying this right, Fort Huachuca?
Yeah, Huachuca,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so the U.S. Army installation known as Fort Huachuca looms large in your article. So can you talk about its history and its relevance to this conversation, including the role of heliographs, which I found particularly interesting?
Yes, so again, grounding this history in Arizona, and then specifically grounding it in this Fort Huachuca, which is southeast Arizona. It's pretty close, maybe, I can't remember, the 15, 20 miles from the U.S., what is now the U.S.-Mexico border. Allowed me to kind of trace how this boomerang travels through technology and through individuals, particularly military officers, right? So someone like General Nelson Miles, who led the final operations against Geronimo in the 1880s, that's stationed, using Fort Huachuca as like his main base to launch attacks against and to chase this list. By the mid 1880s, a small band of Geronimo's followers. And then, so if he represents the boomerang, he will then, and this is another interesting aspect of this, we'll find him in like 1894, using federal troops to put down the Pullman strike, right? Which is, I think up to that point, the biggest labor strike, I can't remember, the biggest or most violent labor strike in U.S. history up to that point. And then this guy will find himself in Cuba. He will find himself, I think he's the one who led the invasion of Puerto Rico during the 1898 Spanish-American War. And eventually he'll find his way to Asia and the Philippines, right? Because, the U.S. technically acquires the Philippine Islands as a resolution of the 1898 Spanish-American War. But it's going to take the U.S., more than a bloody decade of horrific counterinsurgency and violence to, quote unquote, pacify this archipelago of islands and to bring it under some sort of U.S. Political control. Another guy that's really interesting is, and this is another way to track the boomerang, is General John J. Pershing, or General Blackjack Pershing. He was intimately involved also in waging these Apache wars in Arizona and New Mexico in the 1880s. He then also participated in the suppression of the Ghost Dance campaign amongst the Lakota peoples in 1891. And then he too will find his way. He participated in Cuba, participated in the Philippine Islands. He'll become colonial governor of a region of the Philippine Islands. And then his boomerang will come back and we can talk about this more, to the U.S.-Mexico border in the 1910s as a consequence of the 1910 Mexican Revolution that you and I have talked about. I think that was our very first conversation years ago.
Yeah, for sure.
And he ends up leading what is called the punitive expedition, with thousands of U.S. troops, some of whom were from the 10th Cavalry, the Buffalo Soldier unit, a number of Apache and other indigenous scouts. He leads this force into Mexico in 1916 to chase the great revolutionary leader Pancho Villa, because Pancho Villa had earlier crossed the border in March of 1916, and he attacked the city of Columbus, New Mexico. And this punitive expedition, it's all in the name. They were there to punish Pancho Villa for that invasion that resulted in the deaths of a small number of Americans in Columbus, New Mexico. And even before he led this expedition in 1916, Pershing had been sent to El Paso, Texas in 1914, where he used a lot of his colonial governorship experience in the Philippines, and he applied it to working class Mexican-American communities in El Paso. So what I talk about in the article, basing my work on really good historians who have done research into this, is that using kind of medical counterinsurgency or sanitary counterinsurgency that he had practiced in the Philippine Islands, and then applying it to segregated working class Mexican-American communities in El Paso. And he's at the head of a force of 60,000 troops, or some massive amounts of troops. It was the biggest buildup of U.S. troops since the Civil War on U.S. soil. Ostensibly, they were there to prevent spillover from the Mexican Revolution that had begun in 1910. And by 1916, he's at the head of this force that actually invades Mexico with the purpose of trying to find and punish Pancho Villa. And he, as I talk about in the article, he has young military officers with him that included Eisenhower and Patton. Patton in particular really, really despised Mexicans. So, unsurprising that the guy was a racist. But the one thing that I find really interesting is just who constituted the punitive expedition. So it's this guy, General Pershing, who has this long, again, boomerang colonial experience. But then in his force, he includes members of the 10th Cavalry, the Buffalo Soldiers, right? These black soldiers, and then also indigenous scouts, right? So in many ways, they condense in a history of settler colonial violence and the establishment of U.S. sovereignty on the ground in places like Arizona, and it's now being sent into Mexico to punish a revolutionary that had the gall of invading as Pancho Villa said, he invaded the United States. The punitive expedition fails, and it gives rise to one of my favorite quotes that I mentioned in the article, where Pancho Villa supposedly is watching the punitive expedition leaving Mexico, and he says something like, "They came like proud eagles, and they're leaving like wet hens," which is such a perfect quote. I really hope he said that, it's attributed to him. So that's the way I'm kind of tracing out the boomerang, right? So through individuals. Now the technology part is really interesting. So you asked me about the heliographs. So that stuff, when I discovered this, I found it really interesting. So heliographs are kind of like these mirrors that are being used on top of mountains to signal messages across long distances, right? And it was a counterinsurgent technology that the U.S. had adopted from the British. The British were using it in the 1800s in places like India and certain parts of Africa. And then, of course, and this is something else interesting. These settler colonial nations are borrowing technologies from one another and using it, and they're exchanging knowledges, right? That's why in the article, we can talk about this later, in terms of how the U.S.-Mexico border now, in the words of one journalist, is kind of like a Palestine-Mexico border, because so much of the surveillance technologies now on the border were adopted from Israel and what it's doing in the occupied Palestinian territories. So the heliographs, there's a lot of debate whether they actually did much. In terms of how effective they were. If you read the diaries of officials who were on the ground, they said that they did help the rapid transmission of information. They could see the Apache movements, and they could rapidly relay that information to another heliograph station that was miles away, and then that one could relay it to a commander in another post. But it's all about surveillance. It's all about counterinsurgency. It's all about trying to, as I mentioned in the article, render legible both terrain that is inhospitable and unknown to these military officers, but also for the express purpose of putting down indigenous rebellion and resistance to U.S. settler colonialism.
So these heliographs, are they basically like mirrors put up on the tops of hills or mountains that you can move to reflect sunlight in like a Morse code sort of way?
That was my understanding. Yeah, and you would have them. I can't remember how the distance between each heliograph was, and if I remember correctly, they stretched from southern New Mexico all the way into Arizona. So it was like quite the undertaking to actually put these things up onto different mountaintops or hilltops, a distance of in a particular way. But yeah, it was again, there's a lot of discussion about how effective it was, but in the sources. But it was one of these, what I found a really interesting counterinsurgent attempt to kind of quote unquote, using counterinsurgent language, control, pacify, and surveil an area that was populated by rebels, by guerrillas, by insurgents.
And in that way specifically, it is a sort of precursor to drones. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I make a very explicit connection that this was like the first drone, right? Because it's trying to accomplish a similar goal, and the similar goal is to surveil and to control and to make a region legible for the specific purpose of the social and political control. So whether it's a heliograph, right, which now to us is like this really antiquated technology of the late 19th century, or what drones and these aerostat balloons are doing today. Right, it's an attempt to control, to surveil, to restrict movements of people that are deemed enemies of the state, essentially. Whether it was Apache guerrillas in the late 19th century to people who are seeking asylum in the U.S. because they left a country that was rendered unstable by U.S.-backed death squads and so-called free trade agreements.
Yeah, I find that incredibly interesting. That heliograph to drone sort of line that you trace, I think, is really interesting. Let's go ahead and talk about the Indian Wars, and I was hoping you could discuss the sort of legacy of these so-called Indian Wars, specifically in the Borderland region, and how basic concepts and terms and orientations forged in those wars continue to live on in U.S. imperialist ventures to this day, including and specifically the War on Terror, which you talk about very fascinatingly in this article.
Yeah, and this is one of the things that I've learned the most from reading folks who work on settler colonialism, or who work on tying directly the War on Terror to U.S. settler violence against indigenous people. Because really, and this is something I had this conversation with Nick Estes on his podcast last year, right? This is the first War on Terror. The first War on Terror is a U.S. settler war against indigenous peoples, which begins in the midst of the American Revolution, If we go with Gerald Horne, it's the counter-revolution, right? Yeah. So it's at the very core of U.S. political, social, cultural, and economic power is this particular settler colonialist project, right? This is at its core, and it occupies a central place in a variety of different realms. And in many ways, like it becomes like common sense, like a ruling class common sense or a bureaucratic common sense. So one way to think about this is that some of the legal memorandums that were written up after the attack on 9/11, right? Like the legal memorandums that will justify so-called enhanced interrogation, or especially the ones that will deal with how to imprison and how to like cage so-called enemy combatants who are stateless, who are not fighting, who are fighting quote unquote irregular warfare, and the U.S. Lawyers and legal experts who are writing these memorandums are explicitly designing these memorandums and justifications based on things like the First Seminole War. So there's a famous case in 2011. The U.S. government lawyers submitted a brief in U.S. versus Al-Bahul that compared indigenous tactics used during the First Seminole War to Al-Qaeda. And they used that as a basis to justify the indefinite detention of enemy combatants who were, quote unquote, stateless and who were waging, quote unquote, irregular warfare. So it's at the I referenced earlier that the very core of an immigration regime, restrictive regime that gets created at the end of the 19th century, that's based on laws that plundered and took away and deprived Native American communities of their sovereignty in a variety of different ways. So one way to trace this really is to think about immigration law and to think about these legal memorandums, that 9/11 War on Terror legal memorandums that emerged. Another way is to think about like the military aspect of it, right? So in military culture, whether it's counterinsurgency doctrine or even to the naming of military hardware, like you look at all the different military hardware that's named after indigenous groups or communities, right? The one I cited in the article when I was talking about Vietnam, and we should probably talk about Vietnam at some point, is that some of the surveillance planes that were used by the U.S. in waging its colonial war against Vietnam were called Mohawks, or referring to territory being held by Vietnamese enemies as quote unquote Indian country. So right, Michael Hurd, this journalist, has this great line. I'm gonna butcher it, so I'm gonna paraphrase it. Something about how Vietnam was where the Trail of Tears was leading all along. So even like in the mind of military policymakers, officers, theorists, their enemy is fundamentally always the indigenous rebel. Even though on a superficial level, it might be, Iraqis, Vietnamese, et cetera, like the way that they design their policies, their ideas, what is the enemy other to them, I would make the argument it still remains this indigenous rebel that rebelled against the U.S. Settler colonial project since the 1770s. And the most famous example of this is in the operation that led to the killing, the assassination of Osama bin Laden. Like in that operation, his code name was Geronimo. Like there's a reason why they chose that code name, right? Like that Geronimo remains like that intransigent rebel that they were, running after for years and years, and they couldn't capture him until they finally did. To me, that's really telling about the central place that these histories of settler violence against indigenous groups and communities occupies within U.S. bureaucracies, particularly U.S. military bureaucracies.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just goes to show that, settler colonialism in ways both material and psychological is not a thing in the past, but an ongoing process and an ongoing lens through which the American empire views all of its entanglements. And that flies in the face of many arguments, one of which is like this recent patriotic socialist line that, settler colonialism and the land back movement need to be rejected because these things have happened so far in the past, and that, we have to accept the basic reality of what is here. So you see how this settler colonial logic and this apologia even infiltrates and seeps into ostensibly radical or so-called revolutionary left mindsets and formations in the U.S. and in settler colonial societies. It's not an accident. And framing that, the genocide of the indigenous people of North America, specifically the U.S. states' orientation towards it as the first war on terror, I think is a very helpful and very interesting way to frame it. And yeah, calling bin Laden by his code name Geronimo, speaks fucking volumes.
Yeah, to me that says everything. I think I also mentioned in the article this tweet that Max Boot had, I don't know, a couple of years ago now, where he was criticizing calls then for the U.S. to withdraw from Afghanistan, and he basically compared the U.S. role in Afghanistan as like the latest chapter in the Indian Wars. So sometimes these like motherfuckers like can't help themselves, and like they kind of say the silent part out loud. Exactly. So at what the frontiers of U.S. empire are ever shifting, right? And at this point they're global, but at one point they were continental, and those wars against the so-called Indian Wars really established the logics, the mindsets, and the practices of U.S. empire as it expanded abroad, and that's really another one of these main ideas that I'm trying to convey in these articles.
Yeah, and you convey it very, very well. You mentioned earlier the Spanish-American War, how that conflict in particular advanced the ball, as it were, for U.S. imperial acquisition and set the stage for, as you say in your article, quote, 30 invasions of Latin American and Caribbean countries during the first 3 decades of the 20th century. So can you kind of talk about that war and what took place in the wake of it?
Yeah, so one thing that you see after the Mexican-American War is this slow U.S. expansion, both into Asia, which represented in the 1850s by Commodore Perry sailing over to Japan and basically forcing Japan to open its economy, to Latin America. The only interruption is the interruption of this expansion is caused by the Civil War. But after the Civil War, particularly after 1867, you see this expansion both into the Pacific world particularly in trying to force open other Asian nations, like in Korea, and then trying to develop a sphere of influence in China. But then you also start to see the U.S. movement, imperial movement, down into the Caribbean and into South America. So, I think according to someone like Greg Grandin, the historian Greg Grandin, there's like thousands, more than 4,000 or 5,000 instances between 1867 and 1897 in which the U.S. will send gunships into a particular Latin American harbor and threaten them if they don't agree to certain, mutual trade agreements or political agreements. So that's even before we get this war in 1898 between Spain and the United States. That's essentially caused by there's a Cuban independence effort in 1895 led by the great José Martí and Antonio Maceo and Calixto Garcia. The Cubans are fighting for the third time in the 19th century, fighting for their independence. And in 1898, the U.S. sends down the USS Maine into Havana Harbor, and it mysteriously blows up in the harbor, and this becomes the excuse for the U.S. to declare war on Spain. We now know most likely that the USS Maine, something blew up within the ship, and that's what sunk it. It wasn't Spanish sabotage or attack, and that essentially turns the Caribbean into what U.S. policymakers would refer to as the American Lake. And if one of your previous episodes, you were talking about how important it is, or maybe it was on guerrilla history, you were talking about the importance of just looking at maps. I think it was your geopolitics episode. But if you just look at the map of the Caribbean, and you'll see why the U.S. Wanted semi-colonial control over Cuba, why, as a consequence of that 1898 war, the U.S. still holds a lease over Guantanamo Bay, right, to this day. Yeah. The U.S. every year the U.S. sends something like a $4,000 or $5,000 check to the Cuban government to pay for its lease of Guantanamo. Wow. And that money goes into an account that the Cubans haven't touched, right, since 1961 for obvious reasons, right? I think that your audience will know why. But so you see where Guantanamo Bay is situated. You see where Puerto Rico is situated. You see why a couple years later in 1903, 1904, the U.S. helps Panamanians achieve their own independence, and lo and behold, one of the first things this Panamanian government does is sign an agreement with the U.S. and Teddy Roosevelt to build the Panama Canal. Yep. So you just look at the map, right? So what the 1898 Spanish-American War accomplishes is the U.S. achieves a certain dominance over the Caribbean, but also entrance in the Caribbean, and they're building on the writings of people like Alfred Thayer Mahan, who was talking about the importance of naval sea power and the rise of global empires. And he's telling the U.S. to build up the strength of its navy because these maritime commercial routes are also military routes, and that's the route for American greatness. And then if you're looking at this map and you follow and you go across the Pacific, you'll see why the Philippine Islands were also really importantly situated for the perspective of U.S. imperial policymakers. It gives them a foothold, really important physical foothold in Asia that allows the U.S. then to become involved in China, which at that moment, for decades had been divvied up between different European imperial powers. So the consequence of 1898 really set the foothold for U.S. extracontinental imperial growth. Even though in the way, I don't know how you learn U.S. history in grade school up in high school, but usually the way that this history is treated in U.S. schools is that this was the one time that the U.S. was an empire, and in in an absence of mind, it acted like European empires. But then by the early 1900s, it kind of like came to its senses, and it listened to Mark Twain. It didn't listen to Teddy Roosevelt, and we stopped being an empire. When in actuality, in Latin America and the Caribbean alone, the U.S. will invade something like we'll have 34 invasions of Latin America from 1900 up until 1933-34, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt will announce a so-called good neighbor policy. And it was almost always the U.S. Marine Corps being sent down there to invade, to take out some government that was seen as an adversary to U.S. political and economic interests, or a government that didn't manage to establish some sort of political stability, making things dangerous for U.S. business interests, and therefore the U.S. had to send its Marines down. The one guy, if we want to think about the trajectory of the colonial boomerang, the one guy to follow through this history is a guy, one of the most highly decorated Marine military officers, Major General Smedley Butler. Jonathan Katz just came out with a really excellent book about this guy's career. Smedley Butler lied about his age. He was 16, but said he was 18 so he could fight in the Spanish-American War. And from then on out, he's going to be involved almost in every single U.S. imperial adventure, whether it's in China or in Latin America. He got 2 Medal of Honors, one in the U.S. invasion and occupation of the Mexican city of Veracruz in 1914, and he would receive a second Medal of Honor a year later after the U.S. invaded Haiti and would occupy Haiti from 1915 to 1934. But by the end of his time, Smedley Butler realizes that he essentially had been a handmaiden for U.S. capital interests, and he has his famous pamphlets called "War is a Racket," when he talks about one of his best quotes from that is where he says, he said, I could have taught Al Capone something. The best he could do was operate his racket in 3 districts in Chicago. I operated the racket on 3 continents. And one of his last public appearances or controversies was he was police commissioner of Philadelphia, and he started talking shit about Mussolini in the early 30s. And that got him removed from his post because it made international news. Yeah, this guy is fascinating. And when I teach my U.S. Empire history class here at ASU, I use him to kind of take my students through the first 3 decades of U.S. Empire in the Caribbean and Latin America, and it's just constant invasion after invasion. But the Mexican Revolution taught the U.S. Empire the dangers of economic nationalism. Right, if you overplayed your hand economically, you're going to arouse popular resistance. And the Mexican Revolution was one big instance of this. And then in the 1920s, Augusto Cesar Sandino's little crazy army, in the words of one journalist, in Nicaragua, showed the U.S. the dangers of political nationalism and what U.S. interventions could do in arousing popular political nationalism and trying to kick out the invaders. And that, combined with the Great Depression, as the argument goes, especially this is Greg Grandin's argument, this led first Herbert Hoover and then FDR to rethink what U.S. empire should look like and how it should operate. And eventually we'll somewhat accept the national sovereignty of Latin American countries for at least a decade, let's say that.
Yeah. That's incredibly fascinating stuff, all of it. I certainly agree about how I was taught the Spanish-American War and its implications. And I think even today, I listen to a lot of liberal geopolitical forecaster people lately, and they talk about, they don't talk about American imperialism. Some even outright deny that what we have is an empire. And there's this colloquial sense that people have that the age of imperialism was this, pre-World War time that has now ended. And I think that's why imperialism, the use of even that term sort of falls off and had to be brought back by the left insisting that America still has an empire and is very much still engaged in imperialism. But it's not at all surprising that many Americans conditioned in the education system would come out not wanting or not willing to call America still an empire or an imperialist power, and to think of the age of imperialism as something that is in the past.
No, I think one of the interesting ways that at least some academics have pushed back against the idea of U.S. empire to really start to highlight almost exclusively so-called agency in places like Latin America and the Caribbean, right? So if we insist on calling the U.S. an empire in Latin America, that somehow negates or subsumes the agency of Latin Americans themselves. And it's an interesting argument because we've seen it pop up a lot recently, I would say, at least online and in some think pieces in the last 2 to 3 years, as this idea has migrated from certain academic circles into policy making circles.
Yeah, very nefarious line of logic. I can see where that can lead to straight up apologia. Yeah. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the psychology and the paranoia around the border and the borderland in the American mind. You talked earlier, you mentioned imperial anxiety and how moments of imperial anxiety tend to exacerbate the maintenance and militarization of the border. We talked earlier about the El Paso shooting and the settler colonial racist mentality that was behind it. And even the criminalization of marijuana was rooted in racism against Mexicans in particular. So all that in mind and more, can you kind of talk about how the American mind has wrestled with the border and how there's, what the specific threats and enemies were and how that's kind of evolved over time?
Yeah, so I think this is something that been obsessed with for a long time, mostly for personal and now I guess for political and academic reasons. But I think one way to think about this is to say the militarization of the U.S.-Mexico border began in 1910 as a consequence of the Mexican Revolution. And as I mentioned in the article, you start to see the building of a border fence between Mexico and California in 1909 to keep out certain cattle-borne diseases. But then as a consequence of the Mexican Revolution, U.S. Elites really started to fear the spillover of the Mexican Revolution. And also the Mexican Revolution created the violence of it, this at least 10-year long period of military violence, did create refugees and migrants who went north and who started to work and who started to create communities mostly in what is now the Southwest United States or the West Coast in places like California. And it was the influx, in many instances, the influx of large numbers of newly arrived Mexicans as a consequence of the Mexican Revolution that then leads to the hardening of both an immigration regime that was already highly exclusivist, but also the hardening in terms of like building border fences, which really takes off during the 1910s in the midst of the Mexican Revolution. And then it starts to generate conversations within U.S. Congress about what to do about immigration, how to restrict immigration. And this is also the era of eugenics and thinking about how, Mexican people from Southern Europe, people from Asia, people from other parts of the world were racially inferior in eugenicist terms. And if you allow them into the country, they're going to pollute, quote unquote, pollute the racial body politic of the United States nation. And this is what leads to this period from 1924 up until 1965 of a really exclusivist, highly restrictive immigration regime that begins in 1924 as part of the National Origins Act, which severely restricted or prevented wholesale the migration of Asian peoples into the United States, and especially the language is like swarthy Europeans, right? So like Southern Europeans, Eastern Europeans, discriminatory against Jewish communities as well. From 1924 to 1965, this remains mostly in operation. Alongside the National Origins Act, you have the official founding of the Border Patrol, right? La pinche migra, as some of us refer to it. So it's by no accident as well that you have the creation of a highly restrictive, racist immigration policy regime created. At the same time, you create for the first time an official Border Patrol police force that will, for the next several decades, will devote as much attention to keeping out undocumented migrants coming from Mexico as much as they will do to policing Mexican-American communities living in the borderlands. Like, it's a dual project that they're following and beyond the parameters of what they're supposed to be doing, which is so-called border enforcement and preventing illegal crossings as they see it. So it's part of this. So a lot of this has to do with this idea of, these racialized others and what place they don't occupy or shouldn't be allowed to occupy within the United States. Now, one of the interesting things of the National Origins Act, and this represents, I think, another facet of this, and it also represents or highlights the power of Southwest agribusiness capitalists, is that highly restrictive immigration regime made an exception for Latin America because these Southwestern agri-capitalists knew that they desperately needed cheap labor coming from Latin America, and particularly from Mexico. So there's also, if you look at congressional discussions from like the 1910s and 1920s, the congressmen from like Texas will go to great pains to describe Mexican migrant laborers as homing pigeons. They'll come here to work, but like a homing pigeon, they'll always go back to their home in Mexico. And that's one of the ways that they would justify excluding them from this racist National Origins Act that prevented people from other parts of the world to come into the United States. There's another congressman, his quote, like I don't have it in front of me, but he has this quote where he says, look, these people are coming here to work and then they're going to go back to Mexico. They're not coming here to establish communities, and they're not going to produce the next generation of doctors, lawyers, and college professors. And every time I read that, I fucking laugh my ass off because he was wrong. Thankfully, he was wrong. And then we get these interesting, this idea then, it's interesting, once Mexican laborers cross that border, they're no longer Mexican nationals. They're racialized. That the idea of a Mexican becomes racialized, and that comes as soon as you cross the border. So the very idea of labor in the Southwest becomes racialized, right? This idea that because someone's Mexican, therefore they are working class and they are a certain type of laborer. And actually, I think it was in the 1930 census where Mexican actually gets included as like a racial identity, and then they took it out. This brings us to, we can talk about World War II. You could talk about how, some of the first border fencing that gets rebuilt on the U.S. The California-Mexico border in the late 40s under Truman will use a lot of the building materials that were used to intern Japanese Americans during World War II, which is again one of these like historical examples. It's just like says so much. You have the creation of the first migrant detention camps in the late 40s and early 50s in California, in Central California. You have, in the 90s, we talk about how the Border Patrol applied and the U.S. government applied a policy called prevention through deterrence, where they militarize major urban crossing zones, and they're trying to funnel migrants to cross through dangerous places like the Sonoran Desert. And it's so dangerous, they say, there's no way these migrants would risk their lives doing it. And of course, they don't understand. Well, they know that migrants are going to risk their lives in doing it. Some of the predecessors to that idea, you can find it in California-Mexico border in the 1950s, where people are being forced to cross through dangerous mountain routes or trying to swim through canals, and they start to die. Right? So again, this idea of borders, borders imply not just like imperial conquest, this foundational moment of violence to create them, but massive amounts of violence are required to maintain them. And one way that we can track that violence is just the innumerable number of migrants that have died trying to cross this horrific border since, at least since like the 1940s and 1950s.
Yeah. The image that comes to my head, and I'm pretty sure this is the right one, it was that picture a few years ago of the father holding the toddler face down in the Rio Grande. I think that was right. Just yes. Absolutely fucking brutal images. Brutal. And that really is a flashpoint of the whole history of that border. And then just talking about it in imperial anxiety, any enemy that the United States has abroad is almost always then used as an excuse to crack down on the border. So like with the Soviet Union, obviously there's the Cuban Missile Crisis, which America might have seen as in its backyard, and the threat of Soviet expansion to the border. Certainly during the War on Terror time, there was constant talk about having to secure the border because that's the avenue through which Muslim jihadists could sneak through. Trump started his campaign calling migrants criminals and rapists. And then, of course, the Great Replacement Theory, which animates huge swaths of the far right, and now even the mainstream right. Is really premised on this idea that the southern border in particular, with the vague Jewish control above and orchestrating it all, is one of the avenues through which white people themselves are being displaced. And that, of course, was part of the driving ideology behind the El Paso shooter himself. So even when the enemies are far across the world, the border itself continues to be the flashpoint through which Americans will try to wrestle with that enemy and think about an enemy, and then have the paranoia of assuming that enemy is going to use the southern border, never the northern border, but the southern border to come in and attack us.
It's totally. While at the same time, not recognizing that fundamentally, like large swaths of the U.S. economy throughout the 20th century has depended on this type of migrant labor.
Yeah.
And it actually benefits these capitalist interests to have them be undocumented, right? It's not the migrant part that leads to the exploitation of these workers per se. It's the undocumented part, right? Because if they are undocumented, that essentially forces them to the bottom tier of a segmented labor market where they have no rights, where they can't say anything, where because of that condition, their wages are depressed. And then all workers' wages will be depressed as a result, right?
Yep.
But yeah, that could take us into like a totally different avenue. But I will say, like, another important moment is when you get the Bracero Agreement between the United States and Mexico from the 40s to the early 1960s, where you have essentially what we now refer to as like a guest worker program, where thousands of Mexican men were assigned labor contracts and were allowed to come into the U.S. seasonally or temporarily to work in a variety of different economic sectors, mostly agricultural, and then they would go back to Mexico once their contracts were up. Actually, some years ago, I remember when I was in college, I met for the first time a great uncle of mine while I was visiting Mexico, and I told him where my university was, and he was like, "Oh yeah, I used to work there, near there, in like the 1950s." I was like, or 1960s. I was like, man, that's crazy to think about that. And then it's once that labor agreement, it was a highly exploitative labor agreement, right? There was a CBS News report that came out in the early 60s where they interviewed a Florida sugar planter about how he contracted these laborers with the help of the U.S. government. And he has this really chilling quote where he says something like, we used to own our slaves and now we just rent them, which says, I think, a lot as well. And it's once the end of the Bracero program in the early 1960s, combined with in 1965, a reworking of the entire immigration system to get rid of the previous racist, exclusivist version that essentially will create the quote unquote problem of undocumented Mexican migration or undocumented migration in general in the late 60s and early 70s, right? And it's really not until the 1970s where you start to get in U.S. media discourse and political discourse where the figure of the illegal alien really starts to play a prominent role. The illegal alien who's traversing the southern U.S.-Mexico border that's being described as a combat zone. And then by the 80s, you combine that with a drug problem, and that becomes the overriding principal concern in many instances for the U.S. political class. They're not concerned as much by the Soviet Union. What their concern is, according to some of them, is the bigger threat are these quote unquote illegal aliens who are bringing drugs into the United States, which is like makes me like cry because we're still at the same spot today, right? In a way, with large segments of the U.S. political class, and this is it's a thoroughly bipartisan approach. So by the 80s is when you start to see really the institution of a sort of like low intensity, the institutionalization of low intensity warfare on the U.S.-Mexico border, using a lot of technology that actually had its origins in Vietnam, when Robert McNamara tried to create a electronic fence separated North Vietnam from South Vietnam, failed miserably there. It gets brought over to the U.S.-Mexico border. It more or less fails here as well, but it is really good at eventually pushing migrants to try to cross through the most dangerous routes like the Sonoran Desert, leading to thousands and thousands of deaths. I think from 94 till today, we probably close to 9,000 migrant deaths that we know of, and more probably that we don't know of.
God damn. Now, you mentioned Vietnam, and earlier you said that you wanted to come back and touch on that. Is there anything else you wanted to say about how the U.S. war in Vietnam was shaped by and then turned around and helped shape the logics of the borderland and the maintenance of its border? Anything else you wanted to say about that?
Yeah, it was interesting. Like, so you have in the beginning in the 70s, a lot of the electronic surveillance technology that was developed in Arizona, in a place like Fort Huachuca, will make its way over to Vietnam. It will fail miserably, and it will nonetheless find its way back to the U.S.-Mexico border in the 70s and 80s, right? So you read newspaper articles from the late 70s and early 80s. There's a lot of descriptions of the U.S.-Mexico border that will compare it to like Vietnam. We'll compare and we'll be very explicit about Marine sniper technology developed for Vietnam being brought over and given to a border patrol that by the 80s is starting to increase in numbers and is also being outfitted with military-grade weaponry for the first time. They'll start to say, you'll see comparisons of like, the Ho Chi Minh Trail is now in Mexico leading into the United States. The idea of the American Maginot Line, I think I took that from a newspaper article, right? The Maginot Line being that ill-fated French attempt to prevent another German invasion by creating a string of forts, right? And then the Germans just outflanked them and invaded through the north. A lot of American commentators started to reference the U.S.-Mexico border as their own version of the Maginot Line, right? Like a failed futile effort to keep out, again, the dangerous masses who are coming from this, from what they would say the third world, and to completely demographically and politically change the appearance of the United States. And this is really similar in the 80s. A lot of what we start seeing in the 80s is very similar to what we're seeing today. It's just today, I think this idea of like the great replacement theory is being completely mainstreamed in a way that perhaps wasn't as mainstream in the 1980s, particularly with like the Republican Party. They tended to be a bit more, I don't know how to put it. They weren't as, they just weren't as, let's say they were less explicit about the kind of stuff that we see today with today's Republican Party.
Right, a little more buttoned up, a little more concerned about not saying the quiet part out loud.
Yeah, and Reagan was really great about talking about. Okay, let me rephrase that. There's nothing great ever about Reagan. Let's say Reagan was really good at talking about the United States being a nation of immigrants, but for immigrants who came, quote unquote, the right way.
Right.
And in 1986, he actually passed, the U.S. Congress passed his policy that naturalized millions of undocumented migrants, particularly those who were involved in the agricultural sector, which, my parents weren't able to take advantage of that because they didn't work in the agricultural sector. And this is something that many Republicans today will criticize about Reagan, right? He gave the quote unquote illegals amnesty in 1986. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so a lot of the crazy white supremacist replacement theory stuff, like there's a lot of this stuff is really out in the open. It's beginning in the 1980s.
Yeah, very interesting. So now that we have, this idea of the role that the borders played in the American mind and political history, can you talk about Mexico's view of the borderland and of the border and the ways in which Mexicans historically and today have sort of perceived the U.S.'s approaches to the border?
Oh, that's a good one. Well, I mean, the quote that historians of Mexico say that we're not allowed to say anymore, but I'll say it anyway, right? It's a quote that's attributed to Porfirio Diaz, which is the dictator of Mexico from the 1870s to 1910, which says, "Poor Mexico, so far from God, so close to the United States." So it's it's kind of like a cliche quote at this point, but I think it says a lot, at least from how many Mexicans do view its close relation, its physical proximity to the United States, right? It's been invaded by the U.S., 4 or 5 times. A lot of Mexican nationalism has been forged in relation to U.S. Invasions and imperial arrogance. But I think, one way to think about this is to ground it historically. And in the late 70s, when the U.S. government tried to install border fencing in places like El Paso, the Mexican government was vigorously protested such efforts. Even earlier in the late 1960s, when Nixon declared the war on drugs, they started to put up fencing in El Paso for the first, for the big walls recognizable to us today. And the U.S. and the Mexican government would vociferously protest that. They would say, "Why do good neighbors need walls to separate us?" And in the late 1970s, when they tried to extend these walls in El Paso, local activists and the Mexican government, I think, were pretty effective in deriding what they called the tortilla curtain, right? So instead of the iron curtain, they call it the tortilla curtain, yeah. And they railed against it. As the numbers of undocumented migrants surged in the 70s, the Mexican government tended to view any sort of militarization of the border in a highly negative way. But there was very little that they could do, right? There was a big asymmetry of power. Even as they complained in the 80s that the U.S. was, militarizing the border, they complained against U.S. drug interdiction policies that they were more or less coerced into following beginning in the 70s. But it was seen as this thing, if we're such good neighbors, and if we're the last good neighbors, to paraphrase from a recent book, why are you guys building walls between us? We should be building bridges, not walls, is a way that some government officials would put it. And I think people on the ground, they're definitely activists on the ground on both sides of the border. Their lives have been severely disrupted since the late 60s when walls started to go up even more in places like El Paso, in Nogales, and in Tijuana and San Diego. Their everyday lives have been completely disrupted, having to wait in long lines to go through these searches, people who would cross the border to shop, to work, etc. It's really inconvenient. And culturally, it's had an impact as well, right? These used to be transnational communities. What happens to them when a regime of walls and surveillance, militarized surveillance, what happens to that transnational culture is a big deal. So I think I lost my train of thought where I was going with that. But I think another way to think about this is what's been happening more recently in Mexico, and particularly since the presidential election and incoming of Andrés Manuel López Obrador. On the one hand, and I don't know if you want to get into this now, but we can't. We're talking about AMLO, but on the one hand, he's been particularly in the area of drug interdiction. Like he's essentially kicked out, DEA agents. He recently kicked out a DEA plane. Like he is seemingly forcing through a negotiated or a new relationship between both countries when it comes to the issue of drug trafficking and transnational criminal organizations. He seems to be, sketching out a more nationalist posture. But then when it comes to the issue of Central American and other asylum seekers and refugees, he, like previous administrations, seems to be towing the line, which is essentially using Mexico itself has become the wall. The entire country has become the wall for Central American and other refugees coming from other parts of the world, essentially functioning as a sort of like colonial gendarme for U.S. immigration policy. In a way, the U.S.-Mexico border has expanded beyond its physical location, and it's gone down to the Guatemala-Mexico border. It's acquired a maritime border, right? The U.S. has been training border patrol units in the Dominican Republic for decades now, teaching them on how to prevent Dominican, Haitian, and Cuban immigrants from reaching the U.S. by using the Caribbean Sea and the Gulf of Mexico as a maritime border. It's interesting now to see kind of like mainstream political reporting on the relationship between the U.S. and Mexico, and how AMLO is usually reported as being a fiery populist or leftist, asserting a nationalist stance vis-a-vis the United States, something that previous administrations did not do. But I think it's only half right, and in many instances, he's just following the line that previous presidential administrations have followed for decades now.
What's the motivation to continue to follow that line for a president that seems so willing to tackle other topics like poverty and corruption that have been, mainstays of the Mexican political environment for a while now? Why would he just continue on? What are the interests of Mexico with regards to making that the de facto border or the buffer state with Central America? What benefits accrue to Mexico because of that?
No, that's a great question. It's tough. I mean, it's a tough one as well. I think, particularly since the late 80s, when the neoliberalization of the Mexican economy really took off, and then that culminates with the negotiation of NAFTA in 1992, and then it goes into effect in 1994, the Mexican economy is so thoroughly integrated into the American economy that I think previous administrations viewed that they were previously in an asymmetrical relationship with the United States. That economic integration, I think, made that asymmetry even wider. So if Mexico tried to do some sort of policy reasserting a nationalist stance as it pertained to, I don't know, a specific policy, there's a fear that the U.S. will retaliate economically, and the Mexican economy fundamentally depends on the U.S. economy. It depends on migrant remittances. It depends on tourism. Manufacturing, et cetera, capital flows as well. So I think, at least my view, I think this is what the AMLO administration has also done, in particular, in relation to your specific question about migration policy, is that they've looked at some of the polls that have been done domestically in Mexico since 2018, and they see that their posture of not explicitly saying that they're following the U.S. line, but in practice they are following the U.S. line, is not an unpopular one. That cracking down on Central American refugees and asylum seekers may not be an unpopular one, which is, for me as the son of migrant parents from Mexico, seems, it's difficult for me to. I understand it intellectually, but like politically and personally, it like just fucking pisses me off. Millions of Mexicans have come to the United States. You are a nation that has produced millions of migrants. How then can you turn around and act as a colonial gendarme for U.S. immigration policy to keep out people who are not coming in as undocumented migrants? They're coming in to exercise both U.S. and international rights, which based on the seeking of political asylum. Right? That is an international law. That is actually U.S. law that has been on the books since like 79, 80. So I view it as AMLO being tactical and saying, okay, we'll cooperate with you on this area because politically it won't hurt us domestically. Mm-hmm. And we can say that, we're working together on this. You don't retaliate against us, economically. but it's the people who suffer are refugees and asylum seekers.
Absolutely, yeah, the most vulnerable. And that's one of the just pros and cons geopolitically of bordering a hegemon or an empire, is that your politics are going to be inexorably shaped by them. Now, you have some benefits, like the tourist industry, the integrated economies. Certainly, the U.S. is not going to allow any other foreign country to invade and take over Mexico, for example. But you're also subordinated to the ultimate will of that hegemon in a million different other ways. And so all of your geopolitical maneuvering has to constantly be in reference to the fact that you share a border with the hegemon, where, countries that don't share that border, are distant from large powers, have a little bit more wiggle room in what they're able to do domestically and, with regard to foreign policy.
Yeah, and I think it cuts both ways. It also gives Mexico a certain level of leverage that other small countries facing the U.S. empire don't necessarily have, right? Like, you could use the border as leverage in a certain way, particularly because the U.S. for decades now has viewed the southern border, it's kind of like its weak spot, its porous spot. And this is why we have, since the 70s and 80s, just billions of dollars being poured into the militarization of the border, while politically all we hear is about how the border is out of control and it needs to be secured. So I think there's, even though it's an unequal relationship of power, I think Mexico does have a little bit of leverage that it can exercise should it choose to. And I think AMLO has, when it comes to drug interdiction efforts, it has. It's trying to force the U.S. to a different type of approach to the issue of drugs and drug production in Mexico. And then I think what we're seeing now is pretty interesting with the whole Summit of the Americas that Biden is trying to organize in Los Angeles in June, where AMLO has really taken the lead and saying, look, if you don't invite all American nations, we're not going to go. And now you have AMLO saying that he's not going to go. The President Arce of Bolivia said he's not going to go. The President of Honduras is not going to go. The CARICOM nations, I think the 14 or 15 Caribbean nations, have all said they're not going to go if Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela aren't allowed to participate as well. And that the Caribbean, and then domestically here, though, you have Republican and some Democrat politicians telling Biden that he needs to invite Juan Guaido to attend the Summit of the Americas. So talk about like the dissonance, right? Yeah. Talk about the dissonance of approaches. So it's interesting. I think in the world, AMLO has an interesting like throwback look or approach to like Latin American internationalism, right? That I think is tactically on display here, and I find it. I think it's pretty interesting.
Absolutely, yeah. I've been watching that develop, and I'm very happy to see that development and that solidarity with those other countries. It's very cool. Where would you put, for like Americans that don't know shit about other countries and stuff, where would you put AMLO on the political spectrum? And what is your take on his domestic policies, like the trying to attempts to wrestle with poverty and corruption, etc.?
No, your audience isn't on that level, man. It's a complicated question. So AMLO's approach to domestic economic policy has been, I think you can rightly criticize it in a variety of ways. One, he talks about this idea of Republican austerity. This really like a late 19th century Mexican idea that goes back to like Benito Juarez, Mexico's first and only indigenous president. This idea that politicians, in particular, and government officials, need to lead austere lives as a demonstration of republicanism and nationalism. And this is like how he's framed his approach to battling corruption within the Mexican state. Whether that's been successful or not, I think is debatable, and there's all sorts of positions and arguments about it. The other one is this idea that under his presidency, the poor come first. But economists who track this kind of stuff show that his social spending since he was elected president is actually lower than his predecessor, who Enrique Peña Nieto, like the total just anyway, I'll behave and not go off on him. Which the guy is like remembered as pushing through the privatization of education and oil, etc. He's like the prime neoliberal, and yet his social spending gross totals is higher than what AMLO has spent. Also, his like approach to COVID has been highly criticized, right? In terms of not providing enough economic help to small businesses, to individuals. I think Mexico had some of the lowest spending, the stimulus spending in the particularly in Latin America. I think even someone like, if I remember correctly, like even someone like Bolsonaro in Brazil had like a higher stimulus spending, which doesn't really say much. I mean, he had that dipshit probably had other motivations, but so there's also the question of the one that I've been following the most is some of his like approaches to energy and ecology, right? So he's been a high enthusiastic promoter of developing this train, the Tren Maya, the Mayan train, I guess, that will cut through the Yucatan Peninsula and other parts of Mexico. That will be an attempt to bring, I guess they would say it's an attempt to bring like economic development and infrastructure to one of the most, if not the most marginalized area of Mexico, in southern Mexico, and creating this like allegedly eco-friendly, not just train, but like an infrastructure of tourism and economic development that will benefit local communities in a variety of ways. And it's been hotly disputed. Local indigenous communities, many local indigenous communities have spoken against it. They've resisted it. Environmental activists have critiqued his approach to energy independence in the form of, buying up oil refineries and trying to expand oil production in Mexico and dumping more money into the state oil company. But they're really it's super complicated, right? How do you bring economic development into a region that's been marginalized for so long? It is an important question that needs to be addressed. I think local communities, many local communities, activist groups, and some politicians have criticized this particular approach to it. There's also the question of femicide in Mexico, the violence against women. Thousands of women. This is something that obviously that preceded AMLO. Some of his response to especially profile murders of women have been kind of tone deaf and not particularly the most effective responses to it. The killing of journalists has been another big issue that the people have that type of violence and just the general violence in Mexico that took off exponentially since 2006. Like probably more than 500,000 people have died in a violent fashion in Mexico since 2006, since the so-called war on drugs was declared. Probably more than 100,000 people have been disappeared in the so-called war on drugs. So obviously some of this stuff that's happened, it predates him by a long time. And now because he's in power, he's expected to deliver results, and the results have not been forthcoming. And it's personally, one of my uncles was disappeared in 2007. So my family has a very direct stake in this question, and he hasn't always had the best response to this issue when talking to these organizations of people who have organized to find the remains of their loved ones.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of these critiques then, and maybe this is just a function of social media or media in general, a lot of these critiques are like legit critiques, but they can be weaponized in a really unproductive way by bad faith political actors. I'll put it that way. I'll leave it at that. And I think the Mexican opposition to AMLO right now, while they're loud and they have a lot of resources, to me they're showing a lot of weaknesses and deficiencies. And AMLO, to his credit, his popularity is still like above 60% after COVID, after all this stuff, right? So there is something to why people in Mexico are still supporting him at such an overwhelming level.
Yeah. Complicated, messy stuff, but I really appreciate that insight into the current politics of Mexico and the Mexican president. Very interesting. I guess the last question I want to ask you is, now that we've looked back over history and we've analyzed the present, kind of looking forward. I don't want to beat this drum too hard, but I've been reading a lot of like geopolitical forecasting lately, and a lot of the predictions for Mexico are very interesting. That Mexico is going to have more or less a pretty damn good century, and it actually might bring Mexico and America to loggerheads at certain points as the Mexican economy continues to develop. Interesting. That's just prediction, so I can't say either here nor there whether that's going to happen. But just kind of getting your sense of it. Where do you see Mexico in general going over the course of this century, and what role do you see the borderlands and the border itself playing over the next several decades? I know it's an impossible question, but just your sense of it.
Yeah, historians love getting asked about the future. And I'm glad you've been reading stuff that says that Mexico is going to reconquer its borderlands. The white supremacists are going to love this in the U.S. It's not going to drive them crazy or anything. There was actually, really quickly, there's a funny incident in like 2005 or 2006 when we had the reemergence of these border vigilantes like the Minutemen. And a vodka company, I can't remember which vodka company it was, did an advertisement in Mexico where it showed the old map of Mexico prior to 1848.
Yeah.
And like some white nationalist, white supremacist blogger like got his hands on the advertisement and it went viral. And they're like, yeah, see, this is evidence that Mexico is trying to reconquer its lands. I mean, you know, I like the other idea of a taco truck on every corner is pretty awesome. I would take that. Look, I think it's a really difficult question. I think the one that I see is a big question that I've been thinking a lot because I live in a desert and I'm worried that we're going to turn into like Mad Max Fury Road sooner rather than later. The question of water, and because northern Mexico gets much of its water from like the same sources of water that New Mexico, that Colorado, Arizona, Nevada, and parts of Southern California get it, right? Which is Colorado River Basin. So the question of water is going to be a huge one, and I think that's going to, and the broader issue of climate change and how that develops is going to be, you're reading these things that are that give a lot of potential to Mexico, and that's great. But I think the question of water is going to be a huge one. I mean, Mexico City, large parts of Mexico City now to today are consistently face water shortages. Right, this massive metropolitan area, more than 25 million people. It's a great city. I love Mexico City, but how do you get water to people in the city and in the broader metropolitan zone? It is a huge task, and in this era of catastrophic climate change, it's only going to get worse. So I think that's like the one big thing to think about. I think in terms of like Latin American politics, I want to, I like what AMLO's doing right now. And he's not, if we're truly the Americas, then all American nations have to be invited to the summit. What he's doing is calling the U.S. on their bullshit.
Exactly.
And he's calling the U.S. in a highly selective order that it's created in Latin America since the beginning of the Cold War and the formation of the Organization of American States. And they're saying, look, if we are really a summit of the Americas, all countries have to be invited, regardless of whether you agree with them or not politically. Like they live in this region, and they should be stakeholders in what this region is doing. And if you don't, then there is no Summit of the Americas, and it's going to be just the U.S. Best Friends Club plus Juan Guaido, the president without a country. So I think thinking about like Mexico on a global level or a global stage, I think there's so much there that politically Mexico as a country could do, as a big important economy, as a country with a big population. There's so much that can be done. And I think some of it can be done continentally, like in the region, like what AMLO is doing right now. The other one is to demonstrate solidarity at the grassroots. And instead of, persecuting refugee seekers and asylum seekers, to actually work with them. And to work with them in a way where you're not of course, Mexico has limited resources and they have difficulties in engaging this issue, but there's other alternatives to dealing with this in a humanitarian way that recognizes based on solidarity, based on internationalism, and not based on sending out the National Guard to like beat up asylum seekers and refugee seekers. It can be done. So I think that would really elevate, Mexico in an era where we see more and more, for a variety of reasons, increasing numbers of displaced people throughout the globe. Like, what if Mexico became like an example for how to treat these people? I mean, that to me, and particularly considering its own history of migrants, considering its history of, during the 1930s, it accepted under President Lázaro Cárdenas, like 35 to 40,000 Spanish Republican exiles who fled Spain once Francisco Franco lost. Like that should be the example that we emulate. So that's what I hope to see. The reconquer of the Southwest. I mean, I'm in Arizona, so, that'd be awesome. But let's not let that get out here because I might,
Yeah.
Some locals might hear that and say that I'm an advocate for la reconquista or whatever they want to call it.
Successionist.
Yeah, right.
No, I really like that beautiful vision of Mexico leading by example with regards to the upcoming inevitable migrant crises and the intensification that we're going to see in the face of climate change. And that's going to put a lot of stress on both the Mexican southern border as well as the United States' southern border as the equatorial band becomes increasingly hostile to forms of human life and human economic flourishing. It's really going to set the stage for Mexico being pivotal in one way or another. So it's something to keep an eye on for sure. And one thing I think about too, as we're ending this conversation, is American society. You know, for all of its flaws, all of its imperfections. I'm not talking about the American state or the American empire. I'm talking about the society that we all live in, is inexorably informed and shaped by the victims of America, specifically Native Americans and Africans, now African Americans, Mexicans. It's all influencing and affecting the best parts of American culture, and this white nationalist, paranoid, fever dream, hate in your heart bullshit about these, they're brown so fuck them, or they're black so fuck them, or whatever. It's like the biggest strength of American society is the fact that is the influence that Mexicans and black people and indigenous people have had on the entire society and the entire culture. And so I just think that's worth saying. There is no American society as we know it today without these people that American reactionaries and American empire have always sought to put a boot on the throat of. And that's another tension that will continue to play out as long as American society in any way, shape, or form continues to exist.
Yeah, I think we have an important role to push, in a variety of ways, whether it's, organizing politically or other methods to push back against projects that are bipartisan, right? So U.S. empire is a bipartisan project. This horrific, murderous immigration border regime on the U.S.-Mexico border is a bipartisan project. So how can we explode that? And I think that for us living in the U.S., I think that's the two of the most urgent tasks, right? Because dealing with those issues will lead us to deal with the other prime issues of our era, right? Like climate change, environmental destruction, et cetera. But this is why I love teaching my U.S. empire class, just getting students to think about how things like U.S. empire or border walls, these are bipartisan projects. There is no difference. Just one says things out loud and the other one says the same thing, but they use nicer language. It's this, it's like the Malcolm X thing between the wolf and the fox. Like they're still both canines. It's like, let's use that as a political foundation for pushing through meaningful radical reform in the immediate future. I mean, I think that should be part of the immediate horizon.
Yeah, well said. Could not agree more. And yeah, I think many liberals would be quite surprised to realize that the first wall put up was not because of Trump. Like Trump was nothing new. Trump was a continuation of that bipartisanship that implicates them as well.
I totally agree, and there's a reason why when I go visit my in-laws and I start talking shit about Obama as a deporter in chief, I get really bad looks from my mother-in-law. But it's a bipartisan project, and it's a murderous one that we need to work actively against.
Absolutely. All right, Alex, thank you so much for coming on. Another amazing episode. I learned so much. Before I let you go, can you just let listeners know where they can find you and your work and these articles online?
Thank you so much, Brett. Anytime, I love coming on and chatting with you. I always have a great time. You can find me shitposting and desperation on Twitter at Alexander_Avina. I have a website that I need to update soon, alexanderavina.com. And these articles are part of a Substack called Foreign Exchanges. It's if you want really interesting heterodox foreign policy from the left, go to Foreign Exchanges and you'll find some really good stuff. It's created and led by the great Derek Davison. So you can find my articles. I had a recent article on Biden talking about Latin America being in the front yard, not the backyard of the U.S. So if you're interested, please check that out. But thank you so much. This is always fun, man.
Totally. Yeah, I'll link to all that in the show notes then.